Merci beaucoup, Dr. Rondeau.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rondeau. We don't call each other doctors because we're normally friends in real life. When I taught, well, because now I'm retired, when I was a teacher at 8:30 in the morning, the first question I always asked myself was, would I be better off to try to wake them up, or would it be better to just let them sleep? But I figured that this question was no longer useful this morning since everybody here, who after jet lag and so on, I figured if what I had to say was not interesting, well, some people would be awake, and anyway, if what I had to say was interesting, others would sleep anyway. So I will not ask myself this question this morning. Now, I have to say that I'm taking a chapter of the book that we launched yesterday, Visions on Men and Masculinities. So if you don't understand my intervention, there's no problem. You'll always be able to go buy the book. And we get royalties. I also have to recognize the contribution of my colleague, Dr. Rondeau, and Mr. Jean-Yves Desgagnés, with whom this chapter was written. I would add to that, well, I believe the fundamental question for this morning is, why are we here in the province of Quebec, and why are we here now? Because what I was trying to do, well, what I will try to do will be to give us an overview, a kind of retrospective look on what occurred here in the province of Quebec concerning this from 1975 to now. I have to say that our young colleagues made us understand that one of our uses, either for white-haired people or people who have no hair anymore, one of our uses was to kind of do this work of remembering, retrospective work, that these people who in 1975 perhaps were 30 years old, so if we add 35 years to that, well, it means that we are men who all have 59 years of age, of course. So that's how I'm going to start my talk. So what I will do will be to talk about how come changes began at some point in time, also the main benchmark, the main milestones, even if we must not consider these milestones as being something closed or barriers that are watertight. No, quite on the contrary. And also to kind of do an analysis and try to look out, have an outlook for what's coming up. Okay, from the point of view of contextual factors, which meant that in the 70s, a reflection began. We have to see that Quebec is a territory that is close to European influence, but also close to North American influences. We profit from these relations we have with both. And you know full well that whether on the side of the US and on the side of Europe, well, already in the 60s, reflections had begun. We can think about 1968 in France as an example. Some people call symbolically a revolt against the father. And also I think about a certain number of humoristic groups or comedian groups in the province of Quebec who were using humor to shoot down anything that could represent authority, whether it was the army, police, the clergy, politicians. So there was a lot of questioning of masculine attributes. As another influence, of course, the feminist movement preceded what we did. And the feminist movement questioned the legitimacy of the patriarchal power and the social relations between the sexes. And I think that what we also know is that, on one hand, the gay movement was very active in this reflection. We also recognized that they had a reflection that was ahead of time as far as deconstruction of identities that were homo or hetero, and also on the issue of relations between men and women. So these might not be the only influences. I'll talk about another one later on, but I think that these are important contextual factors, especially the movement of the strength of the feminist movement. So the first step is what we call taking care of the me, the je in French, roughly from 75 to 80. Many of the people who were involved in these things came from the world of human relations, came from people who were trained in communications or social sciences, humanities, and I think it was influenced a lot by the humanistic movement and everything which gravitated around growth groups and so on. So for me, it's a bit like a fourth factor also, which meant that there was a certain focusing on the me, which meant that we questioned our relationships as such, and we were perhaps more in the private sphere, questioning the role of the provider, awareness of the double task phenomenon, questioning of the paternal role, and the whole issue of our relationships with our spouses, those that we had, those we didn't have, those we would have wanted to have. But basically, I think things were roughly in that order. I also think that there was the importance of a questioning in which we wanted to act and not just be subject to. And I would add concerning this that it was a questioning that did not want to be a resistance. It did not want to be an acceptation either, a blind acceptance of changes. And we wanted to see where we were located personally. So yes, we wanted to break the emotional isolation, and there's several groups in reaction were born around this. For example, in what we call macho clubs or new taverns, because now women could go into the taverns, which wasn't possible before. So do these groups become the new locations for discussion for the males? Well, now I think that nevertheless there was a reflection and people were taking their distance from the image of the traditional man. After this period of the me, there's a second phase, roughly 1980 to 1985, which was interesting, and it followed the first one because the focus was more on the us. It was more collective, and this through several means. And the things which struck us, amongst others, an initiative which had been taken in Montreal by les Ateliers d'Éducation Populaire, the popular education workshops, of a public evening on the condition of men and the emotional lives of men. The great surprise that 350 people showed up for that evening of information, and many men showed that they wanted to participate in groups of reflection. And also another event, another factor for the collective reflection, a newspaper which was published for several years called Info Man. It wasn't quite the equivalent, but anyway, the close parent of another magazine called La Gazette des Femmes, the Women's Gazette, was volunteer-based, 500 subscribed readers, and they talked about all kinds of themes: work, family, violence, health, and so on. And this newspaper lasted for 5 years until the secretary took off with the petty cash. But anyway, for 5 years, it had an influence, which was important. Here in Quebec, in Quebec City, it was another dynamic. We had for a certain number of years the Sunday brunches once a month in a restaurant in the city. We gathered around a theme. It was completely informal. 20 people, 30 people would show up. But there was an influence, an important influence of this, and I think that the most tangible influence is that it created a group that still exists, which is called Autonomie, which deals with the various questions of masculine relations. And next to this, there are also groups, well, I call more collective growth groups, which were inspired, I think, of the Robert Bly's movement, mythopoetic movement, in which people would find their essence of male and connect it to their internal warrior, well, maybe it replaced the old retreats we used to have in our colleges back then, but it was also an important means. But what you can remember here is that there were venues to collectivize, so to speak, and to think. Third phase, from 85 to 90, I think there was a turnaround from reflection to action, dealing with various themes. I'll go over this quickly. That of domestic violence. Why domestic violence? Because I think it was the tip of the iceberg, which hurt. And it was also an issue for which there were possibilities of funding for various activities. Already in 1989, in a report that my colleague had prepared, already were 16 resources that existed, and these resources sometimes were connected with community groups and sometimes connected with CLSCs or public resources. I think we also have to recognize the inspiration of several American groups. In this topic, I remember I visited in 1982 in Boston the Emerge group, which inspired us a lot. Now, in other themes, we find, well, paternity. There were various things which were developed very quickly also, amongst other on the issue of defending the rights of fathers that are separated, rights of visiting and the rights of keeping the children, also information services, legal recourse following a separation or divorce, and also political lobby and participation to governmental consultations. Other groups promoted paternity, groups on the fatherhood and commitment, and with a certain number of colleagues, we were also interested in prenatal courses adapted to fathers, for the future fathers. I remember full well that when my first boy was born, when the invitation letters arrived, obviously it was sent to my wife with a small mention in postscriptum, your husband is also invited. And during the courses, when I was asked very seriously following the birth if my breasts were painful, I said, I think it's important that we do things for our future parents. It's also an epoch where we developed services to men. I gave you the example of Autonomie, a group in Montreal that was called Cœur à Tout, which dealt with the organization of symposiums, specifically another group which listed the existing resources and documentation that was available. And what we remember here is that on one hand, we went from reflection to action, and secondly, the vitality of the community services. The following step, oops, sorry, I have to skip my slide, I have to move on to the next slide here. The following phase, from 90 to 2000 roughly, there was a consolidation in various ways. First of all, many authors had already started to write on this theme. I can think about people like Marc Chabot, philosopher, the psychologist Maurice Champagne-Gilbert, the chanoine Jacques Grandmaison, a colleague like Michel Doré, who had written a small book on masculine crises, and books that also reached the general public. They were not just academic books, and we started to see theses and academic works on this topic. What was interesting also was that we started to see works with opposed orientations. I can give you an example, simply the Manifeste d'un salaud, which was a rant, so to speak, on what was qualified as being doctrinal feminism, and to the opposed, like Guy Corneau, Père Manquant, Fils Manqué, a book which had a large dissemination in the whole Francophone world. Oh, thanks. Also at that time, we started to better specify various issues on which to work, whether it's delinquency, suicide, or dropping out of school, and also that the existing organizations started to consolidate into associations. Perhaps the association that is most known was that called La Rive, the Association of Resources for Violent Men, who has now become the association called À Cœur d'Homme. And this association, I think, as far as masculine realities, was always extremely present. So we remember this, and we also remember that many academic resources and research teams, well, things were built up, various teachers were implemented and helped students, and also it was the beginning of the implementation of research teams. In the following phase, from 2000 to 2010, I think things turned more into a public policy issue, even if there were already beginnings, if I can say so. For example, the report, which dates of the beginning of the 80s, Un Québec fou de ses enfants, where the whole issue of paternity was put into question. Also, the policy for health and well-being of 1998, where we discussed a certain number of issues. But during the 2000, from 2000 to 2010, Gilles talked about the report that dealt with, that he will talk about this afternoon, the report on the working group on services given to men. So I think this work was important. It's starting to bear fruit. If we can make a connection with the words of Minister Bolduc yesterday, and also there are other elements that were implemented, like, for example, the parental insurance law, question of grants given to the father of the child who has just been born. So what we gather from this period is that I think there was a kind of meshing of the various actors, so to speak. I think it was the strength of the province of Quebec that practitioners, workers, the level of management of the public services, people from the academic world, all these people, I think, spoke to each other, and I think it was a strength, which meant that the social services, the public social services, were involved in these changes. Thank you. So, what we can say quickly, because I only have 2 minutes, I don't want to lead you to think that there was a single discourse as far as the masculine realities are concerned here in the province of Quebec. Quite the contrary. Many of the groups, and many of the groups that are here, are more on a pro-feminist liberal perspective. If we look at Clatterbook's typology, I said earlier on that there's also the mythopoetic perspective, which was also present. There are other people who are more in the perspective of the entitlements of fathers' rights, the defending the fathers' rights in a discourse where oppression touches men and women, perhaps more men than women, that men are victims of a new sexism created by the feminist movement. Or on another perspective, with the radical feminist perspective, where men are seen as oppressors because of the socialization, and we have to be cautious of men and have solidarity with women. So I think we have here a series of discourses that were present. Now, the question I had, is it a social movement, masculine reality? We could say the same thing for the feminist movement, but I think that there are certain elements. There is the establishment of communication networks, activities. On the other hand, there's not necessarily a unity of thought. There's nevertheless a concern on the masculine realities, which is shared. I'll conclude by talking about the future before Mr. Rondeau starts to look at me with evil eyes here. Of course, there are limits to such a presentation. I obviously cannot show all the vitality of what was done here in the province of Quebec, and I think that our discourse was more concerned with the social services and public services, and perhaps not in the domain of communications and arts and all this. The debates will continue in the future. I think that's interesting, and the whole issue of reflection on the complementarity at work, which concerns women, will be done. We know there are several spheres that require important breakthroughs, and that we still have a lot of work to do. And even in discussions yesterday, we said that, for example, are we connecting with such and such a segment of the population according to the ethnic origin, age, sexual orientation, and so on? I think we have to remember that we have to accept the rhythm of change. We are in a change which will go beyond a single generation. And on the other hand, what is very encouraging for young men like you and me, is that there's a new generation, and we can see it here. There are several young men, young workers, young teachers also. And I would also like my presentation to be, for you, perhaps an invitation to do similar work in your state or in your province, in your country, because I think this is one of the things which can remain, to see where we come from, so to speak, as far as masculine realities. Thank you very much for your attention.